It began with just a sentence: pack your bags and leave. Those were the words that echoed out of Ouagadougou on August 18th when President Ibrahim Traoré told the United Nations that its top official in Burkina Faso was no longer welcome. For some, this sounded reckless, even dangerous, a small nation cutting itself off from international accountability. But for millions of Africans, it was a moment of pride, a declaration that finally one of their leaders had the courage to say, "We will not be humiliated. We will not let outsiders write our story for us." The world reacted with shock. The UN report accused Traoré's government of grave violations against children, forced recruitment, sexual violence, and attacks on schools and hospitals. To Western media, these are unthinkable charges. Yet to the people of Burkina Faso still scarred by years of jihadist terror, villages burned, and families torn apart, the accusations feel like more than criticism. They feel like another battle in a long war, the war over Africa's image, dignity, and sovereignty. So the question lingers, is this really about silencing uncomfortable truths, as critics claim, or is it about defending a nation's right to stand on its own feet, to protect its revolution, and to reject outside narratives that undermine its survival? History tells us this struggle is not new. From Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah to Congo's Patrice Lumumba, from Libya's Gaddafi to Burkina Faso's own Thomas Sankara, every leader who dared to break free faced not only bullets, but words sharpened as weapons. And now Ibrahim Traoré stands at that same crossroads. Before we go deeper, I want to pause and welcome everyone here. If you are watching and you believe that Africa's story deserves to be told with truth and with dignity, then this channel is your home. Please subscribe, share this video with friends, and let's begin this journey together. Because what just happened in Burkina Faso may decide not only the future of one small nation, but the direction of an entire continent. In the early hours of August 18, 2025, a decision from Burkina Faso's government sent tremors through the diplomatic world. In a single statement, the office of President Ibrahim Traoré declared that Carol Flores Schmergniak, the United Nations resident coordinator in the country, was now persona non grata. In the language of diplomacy, those words carry a weight as heavy as any weapon. It meant she was expelled, ordered to leave Burkina Faso immediately. Why such a drastic step? The answer lies in a document released by the United Nations only days earlier titled Children and Armed Conflict in Burkina Faso. On paper, it was a report. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it landed like an accusation, a verdict delivered without trial. The report covered the period between July 2022 and June 2024, and its numbers were grim. According to UN investigators, there had been 2,483 grave violations committed against 2,255 children. Among those violations, children recruited as child soldiers, cases of sexual violence, and repeated attacks on schools and hospitals. The report claimed that responsibility lay on both sides of the conflict: extremist groups linked to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and community defense groups aligned at least indirectly with the state. To international observers, these statistics painted a clear and horrifying picture. But to Traoré's government, they looked like something else, a carefully crafted weapon aimed not at helping children, but at discrediting their revolution. In their response, officials argued that the UN never consulted them, never presented solid evidence, and published the report without context, as if the daily reality of villages under siege and families resisting jihadist attacks could be reduced to numbers on a page. For Ibrahim Traoré, this was not just about data or technicalities. This was about image, credibility, and survival. His government is in the middle of a sweeping transformation, building free health clinics, restoring agriculture, encouraging local industry, even investing in technology. In a nation that has endured more than a decade of bloodshed at the hands of extremists, these efforts have been nothing short of revolutionary. But when the United Nations accuses that same government of exploiting children and destroying schools, the achievements are drowned out by scandal. The world remembers the accusation, not the progress. So Traoré drew a line. He declared that such a report without proper consultation or legal documentation could not be allowed to define Burkina Faso. By expelling the UN's top official, he was not only rejecting the report, but also sending a message: we will not allow outsiders to write our history. This decision shocked many outside observers who saw it as a sign of isolation and authoritarianism. But within Burkina Faso, the reaction was very different. Crowds gathered in Ouagadougou, some cheering openly, others quietly relieved that their leader had refused to bow. To them, this was not the silencing of truth. It was an act of self-defense, the defense of a young revolution still struggling to breathe under the weight of foreign expectations. And in that moment, a small, landlocked nation often invisible on the global map reminded the world of something it prefers to forget: sovereignty still matters. For better or worse, a people still have the right to decide who speaks for them and who does not. The breaking point came with a phrase as blunt as a hammer: persona non grata. In the polished language of diplomacy, it means unwelcome, expelled, cast out. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, it was heard more like a war cry, proof that their young president would not bend. When President Ibrahim Traoré's government declared the United Nations top official Carol Flores-Schmergniak no longer welcome in Burkina Faso, it wasn't just paperwork. It was the climax of a storm that had been building for years. Reports, accusations, whispers of misconduct all suddenly crystallized into a single confrontation. And in that confrontation, the stakes were far higher than one woman's diplomatic posting. For the people of Burkina Faso, the accusations in the UN's report were unbearable. Children turned into soldiers, schools attacked, hospitals destroyed, women and girls assaulted. These were not distant statistics for them. They had lived through burned villages, funerals, and the silence that follows gunfire. But to be accused as perpetrators rather than victims was seen as an insult that cut to the bone. One mother interviewed outside a market put it simply: "We bury our children every week from terrorist attacks. Now they say we are the ones harming them. That is not justice. That is cruelty." Inside government halls, the debate was fierce. Some argued for restraint, fearing the consequences of defying the UN. But Traoré chose confrontation. To him, the issue was not simply about a flawed report, it was about the larger struggle for sovereignty. If the world believed the UN's words, Burkina Faso's revolution could be delegitimized before it even had a chance to stand. And so the president chose to act decisively. "It's time to go," he declared. That decision split opinion far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Critics were quick to accuse Traoré of silencing criticism. Human rights organizations warned that by expelling international monitors, vulnerable people, especially children, would lose protection. Western commentators suggested this was part of a pattern. Back in 2022, Burkina Faso had expelled another UN representative, Barbara Manzi, for raising concerns about instability. To them, this was the same script being played again: uncomfortable truths met with closed doors. But supporters both inside Burkina Faso and across Africa saw the moment differently. They called it sovereignty in action. They pointed out that the UN had dropped its report without consultation, without sharing evidence, without recognizing the reality of a state fighting for survival. To them, Traoré's decision was not about hiding crimes, but about rejecting humiliation. A farmer from the Sahel explained it this way: "If America can expel a diplomat for speaking against it, why can't we? Are we less of a people?" Even history seemed to echo in the background. Names like Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, and Muammar Gaddafi surfaced again and again in conversations. Leaders who once stood tall only to be branded dangerous or unstable before being overthrown or assassinated. For many Africans, the UN report felt like the opening scene of that familiar tragedy. A respected leader painted as a villain, his government discredited, his revolution poisoned in the eyes of the world. By expelling the UN's top official, Traoré was signaling that he would not wait for that script to play out again. The international reaction reflected this divide. Western governments expressed concern, warning that Burkina Faso risked isolation. Meanwhile, voices across Africa and the global south praised the move. On radio stations from Bamako to Accra, callers described it as a moment of courage, a refusal to be dictated to. On social media, hashtags celebrating African sovereignty trended for days. It was in every sense a high-stakes gamble. Traoré had chosen confrontation over compromise, sovereignty over diplomacy. Whether it would strengthen Burkina Faso or leave it dangerously exposed remained to be seen. But in that moment under the African sun, a young leader made clear to the world that he would not bow, not even to the United Nations. When the news broke that the United Nations top representative had been expelled, reactions inside Burkina Faso rippled far beyond government offices. For ordinary citizens, the announcement carried both pride and unease. Pride because their young president had stood tall against one of the most powerful institutions in the world. Unease because the United Nations was not just an abstract body, it was also the face of humanitarian aid, food supplies, and health programs that many villages depended upon. In Ouagadougou, some celebrated openly in the streets. Young people waved flags chanting that Burkina Faso would no longer be treated as a colony in disguise. For them, Traoré's decision was an act of dignity. Finally, someone is defending us, one university student said. We are tired of outsiders accusing us without living our pain. In their eyes, this was about restoring honor to a country scarred by decades of violence and neglect. But not everyone was celebrating. In rural clinics and schools, aid workers worried quietly about what might come next. Would international programs be cut back? Would funding for medicine, education, or food relief dry up? For families already living with scarcity, the thought of losing outside support was frightening. One nurse at a provincial hospital put it bluntly, "We want sovereignty, yes, but sovereignty will not fill an empty stomach." Politically, the decision sharpened lines within the country. Supporters of Traoré hailed him as a defender of independence, a leader willing to risk isolation rather than surrender to foreign pressure. But his critics, including some civil society groups, feared the move would consolidate too much power in the presidency. By expelling the UN, they argued Burkina Faso risked silencing not only outside critics, but also its own internal dissent. These fears were amplified by history. Across Africa, leaders who challenged global powers often faced similar accusations. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso itself, and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, each had insisted that Africa must chart its own path. Each had also been branded dangerous, destabilizing, or radical. And in nearly every case, the result was tragedy, coups, assassinations, wars. For older Burkinabe, those memories are not distant history but living scars. The decision to expel the UN's representative reopened those memories and forced people to ask, is history repeating itself? At the same time, the move deepened the sense that Burkina Faso is engaged in more than just a war against jihadist groups. It is fighting a war of narratives, a struggle over who gets to define the nation's identity. In this sense, the expulsion was not only about rejecting one report, it was about rejecting decades of outside voices that too often defined African nations only by their failures. Traoré's supporters argued that unless Burkina Faso took control of its own story, it would forever be trapped in the shadow of others' judgments. The political consequences were immediate. Opposition voices accused the government of closing doors rather than building bridges, but the majority of citizens seemed to rally around the president. In their view, the choice was stark: either endure humiliation at the hands of international institutions or stand proud even if it meant standing alone. In the end, the expulsion revealed a deeper truth about Burkina Faso's current revolution. It is not only about roads, hospitals, or reforms. It is about dignity, the idea that even a small, landlocked country has the right to say no when its survival and honor are on the line. Whether that dignity will strengthen the nation or expose it to new dangers is still uncertain. But one thing is clear: the decision has bound Traoré's government and his people together in a new and fragile unity, forged not in peace but in defiance. From Washington to Brussels, the news landed like a thunderclap. The United Nations had been told to leave Burkina Faso, and suddenly the world was forced to confront a question it rarely asks: what happens when Africa says no? In the United States, the reaction was cautious but clear. Officials expressed deep concern, warning that without international oversight, children and vulnerable communities could be left unprotected. American media outlets echoed that line, portraying the expulsion as another sign that Traoré was tightening his grip on power and pushing Burkina Faso further into isolation. To many in Washington, this looked less like sovereignty and more like authoritarianism dressed up in revolutionary clothing. But for ordinary Africans, the American narrative rang hollow. After all, as supporters of Traoré quickly pointed out, the United States itself has often expelled foreign diplomats when it deemed them unwelcome. Under Donald Trump, for instance, an entire group of Russian diplomats was ordered to leave American soil in response to intelligence disputes. If the U.S. claims that right for itself, why should a small African country be denied the same power sovereignty they argued must be equal, not a privilege reserved for the strong? In Europe, leaders voiced similar worries, warning that Burkina Faso was cutting itself off from vital humanitarian networks. Yet, behind closed doors, diplomats admitted another truth: this was not just about aid or children's rights. It was about power. If one African government could expel the UN without suffering major consequences, others might follow, and that could unravel decades of international influence across the continent. Meanwhile, across Africa and the broader global south, the expulsion sparked a very different conversation. Radio talk shows in Mali, Niger, and Ghana praised Traoré's decision as an act of courage. Social media was flooded with messages of solidarity, many comparing Burkina Faso's move to historic moments when post-colonial leaders had first dared to challenge foreign interference. For these audiences, the issue was not whether the UN's report was accurate, but whether Africans would continue to allow outsiders to define their destiny. Even beyond Africa, the debate resonated. In parts of Latin America and Asia, commentators drew parallels to their own struggles with Western institutions like the IMF and World Bank. The question once again was who controls the narrative of nations and who gets to decide what is legitimate governance. For the United States, the challenge is particularly sharp. On the one hand, Washington cannot simply ignore allegations of child exploitation and rights abuses. On the other hand, it risks appearing hypocritical if it insists on rules for Africa that it does not apply to itself. This tension leaves America in a difficult position, criticized too harshly, and it fuels the narrative of Western double standards. Stay silent, and it risks losing influence in a region already leaning toward independence and new alliances. In the end, the world's reaction reveals as much about itself as it does about Burkina Faso. To the West, the expulsion is troubling. To much of Africa, it is inspiring. And to the rest of the global south, it is a reminder that sovereignty is not given, it is claimed. Burkina Faso has done what few nations dare to do. With one firm decision, President Ibrahim Traoré told the United Nations, "Your authority here is over. It's time to leave." For some, this was a reckless gamble that strips vulnerable children of protection. For others, it was a long-awaited act of courage, a small African country standing tall in the face of centuries of outside control. But beneath the headlines, the deeper truth is unavoidable. This is not just about Burkina Faso, nor is it only about Ibrahim Traoré. It is about Africa as a whole, about a continent at a crossroads caught between dependence on global institutions and the dream of true sovereignty. Every expulsion, every rejection, every moment of defiance forces Africa closer to a final question. Will we continue to let outsiders referee our lives, or will we build the strength to stand on our own? And here lies the danger. Sovereignty without capacity can quickly turn to suffering. If aid disappears, if children go without medicine, if schools collapse, then what was gained in dignity may be lost in human cost. Yet dependence without sovereignty is no less dangerous, leaving nations forever at the mercy of powers who claim to help but too often dictate. The balance is delicate, and history has shown how easily it can tip. For the United States and the West, this moment should be more than a diplomatic scandal. It should be a wake-up call. Africa is no longer content to be managed, measured, and judged by external hands. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, for all their controversies, represent a rising demand: respect us or step aside. The question now is whether Washington, Brussels, and New York will adapt to this reality, or whether they will continue trying to impose a fading order. And so, my friends, the burden of choice falls not only on governments, but on us as people. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's reforms are truly effective, yet can we continue to trust him to carry this revolution forward? Or should Africa prepare for someone else to step into his place? And beyond that, should Africa keep calling on the United Nations to monitor our elections, our schools, our children? Or should we finally build the muscle to do it ourselves, even if that means walking a hard and lonely road? I want to hear your thoughts. Was Burkina Faso right to show the UN the door, or was this a dangerous step that could harm the most vulnerable? Share your perspective in the comments, because this is not just a story about one country, it is about the future of a continent and the lessons it holds for all of us. And if you believe that truth is more important than headlines, if you believe Africa's story deserves to be told with dignity, then please subscribe. Share this video with friends and family, because the world will keep debating what happened in Burkina Faso, but together we can make sure the real story is not forgotten.